Welcome to AP World History Modern, better known as WHAP. I want to welcome you guys on this journey across time and space with me. We're going to cover everything important that has happened in the world in the last roughly 800 or so years. Every lecture that we do, we start with a big question. And how the big questions work is that's the thing that I really want you to understand by the time you finish watching the video or sitting through the lecture in class. Now, the first big question we should answer is, how is this course, WHAP, like a Rubik's Cube? One thing you're going to learn about AP World History, and this is true of a lot of AP courses, there's just a lot of content to learn. There's just a lot of facts and information that you're going to have to stuff and store in that brain. And so one of the things that I encourage you to start doing immediately is to organize the stuff you're learning more effectively. And we can do that in a world history course by breaking it down into smaller segments and units. And so we will break down this course first into different time periods. We can break down everything that's happened in the last 800 or so years chronologically. World history is essentially just the human story. And the human story can be broken down into different chapters. And those chapters are chronological. And the College Board does that for us. So the College Board has given us our chronological time periods. Those are these, and they've divided it up into 9 units. Now, we're going to have a different unit structure than how the College Board does it, but we're going to follow basically their same pattern. The one thing we will definitely follow is these 4 chronological units. So AP World History Modern starts in Period 1, which is Chapter 1, which covers the period from 1200 to 1450 CE. Period 2 is from 1450 to 1750. Period 3 is 1750 to 1900. And then period 4 is 1900 to the present. And you'll note that these different time periods are not weighted equally on the AP World History exam. Let's start with this period 1. Period 1 we're going to refer to as the Age of TransRegional Interactions. It starts in 1200 CE and it ends in 1450 CE. CE, by the way, is just shorthand for the Common Era. And why we call this the Age of Transregional Interactions is that you can break down that word transregional. Trans means across. So there are people that are crossing different regions around the world, and they're interacting with one another on that scale. So this is from 1200 to 1450 CE, the Age of Transregional Interactions. And if we were to freeze time in 1200, this is what the map of the world looked like. And you can see different states that had started to form, especially across Europe, Asia, a little bit in North Africa, some here in the Americas. Now, it's important to recognize that there are people living in these white sections of the world. They're just not as well organized into more centralized states. We're going to spend some time in our different regions of AP World History. We're going to spend some time in East Asia, which means we'll go to China and Japan and the Korean Peninsula. We're going to learn about South Asia, which is primarily the modern-day countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. We're going to spend some time in Southeast Asia, learning about the modern-day region, which incorporates the countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Burma, Thailand, Indonesia. We're going to spend some time on what's known as Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, the Islamic world, which the center is in the Middle East, but really the Islamic world, and by 1200, had spread all the way from India, all the way across North Africa and into Spain. So we'll spend some time learning about the Islamic world. Then we'll go to Africa and spend some time learning about some amazing African kingdoms that had formed by around 1200, like Ghana and then later Mali and the Swahili coast states and Great Zimbabwe. We'll spend some time in the Americas learning about some major states and empires, including the Maya and the people of South America, such as the Inca. We'll spend some time in Europe learning about some major transformations that were also taking place in Europe from 1200 to 1450. So we're going to sew this patchwork quilt together because, again, people were interacting, with the exception of the Americas, which was isolated. The people of Afro-Eurasia, Africa, Europe, and Asia, were all interacting. And we're going to refer to this as the global tapestry, and that will provide us a backdrop as we walk into a study of modern world history. Now, when I say people were connected, what do I mean by that? Well, they were connected across networks of exchange across Africa, Europe, and Asia. There was this major one, which was an overland trade network that connected Europe and Asia, and that's known as the Silk Road. There was a major maritime trade network crossing the Indian Ocean region down here, connecting East Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, China. That's known as the Indian Ocean Sea Lanes. There was a major network that connected North Africa, West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. That's known as the Trans-Saharan Network because it crossed the major geographic feature right here in Africa, which is the Sahara Desert. And we're going to learn about major empires and states that helped facilitate trade in this period, including everyone's favorite, the Mongols. So we're going to spend some time learning about these major trans-regional networks of exchange, which had formed prior to 1200, but that were still very active in spreading goods and culture and religion and language and technology. So this represents 16 to 20% of the AP test. That's period 1. Then we're going to get into period 2, 1450 CE to 1750 CE. This is oftentimes known as the First Global Age. And so you can probably imagine we're dealing with interactions now not just on a trans-regional scale, but for the first time now on a global or worldwide scale. As you can see from this map, there were some major land-based empires that had started to form across Asia, including the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the Qing Empire in China, the Russian Empire. So we'll study each of these major land-based empires. Whenever we're talking about empires, an empire is a large territory made up of diverse people that speak different languages, maybe practice different religions, maybe represent different ethnic groups, that have a single centralized leader, ruler, an emperor. So that's what an empire is, a large, diverse, single centrally ruled state. A single person cannot rule an empire by themselves. And so we'll talk a lot about how empires were ultimately forged. You're going to need a whole bunch of different elements to add up to create an empire. You're going to need a military to engage oftentimes in that initial military conquest. You're going to need local officials or bureaucrats to collect taxes. You're going to have your different social class groups. You're going to have your landowning elites. You're going to have your poor peasants. You're going to have a religious majority. Oftentimes, you're going to have religious minority groups. You're going to have to figure out how do we incorporate and unite all of these diverse people and get them to be loyal to the state. One thing that leaders or rulers do in this period, is, as they've done previously, is they construct magnificent monumental architecture, big buildings showing off the wealth and power of the state, or even sometimes even small art, like these miniature paintings, which were produced by oftentimes Islamic emperors. So we'll spend some time talking about the land-based empires in this period. But this is also called the First Global Age, and not only were there land-based empires across Asia, but there were also maritime empires starting to form, or ocean-based empires, many of which were founded by the major European powers at the time, starting with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then later the British, the French, the Dutch. They are going to establish maritime empires over here in the Americas. First the Spanish, the Portuguese, and then later the British and French, and also major maritime empires across the Indian Ocean region with Portuguese, and then later the Dutch and other groups taking colonies across the Indian Ocean region. And this is going to lead to a flourishing of global trade. We're going to see different products exchanged like sugar and furs and tobacco and cotton and silver. And so we'll spend a lot of time talking about a major maritime trade, which was made possible partly by the development of new technologies, first in the area of boats. Now, some of this technology was not new. It was simply taken from previous time periods and then improved upon. Technologies like the compass. This is known as the astrolabe, and it helps you kind of determine your latitude on the globe. Europeans are going to spend some more time developing better maps and cartography. Why ultimately are they creating these empires in places like the Americas? They're trying to extract resources like silver, which was found in this giant mountain in South America known as Potosi. This is going to lead to the Columbian Exchange, a worldwide exchange of domesticated plants and animals, but also other biological characteristics like disease, which gets brought over and leads to the death of many people in the Americas. We're going to talk about how different race and ethnic groups were formed and constructed in the Americas as a result of some new intermixing that is taking place. As religions spread, we start to see images develop like this one. This is the Virgin of Guadalupe. We'll spend some time learning about. So this period is also well known for these transoceanic interconnections. And this represents 24 to 30% of the AP test. That's period 2. Period 3, from 1750 to 1900, known as the Age of Revolutions. Now, when you think of a revolution, you probably have in your mind where people take to the streets and they overthrow their government, they replace their government. And that is one definition of a revolution, right? A political revolution, the overthrow and replacement of the government by the people of that state using some form of force. And in this age, from 1750 to 1900, there are a number of political revolutions, many of which were based upon these new ideas about liberty and freedom and equality that start to form in what's known as this major movement called the Enlightenment. Well, we're going to have some revolutions, starting with the American Revolution in 1776, followed shortly thereafter by some major revolutions in France and Haiti, the only successful slave rebellion in history, led by this man Toussaint Louverture. Revolutions in Latin America, led by great leaders like Simon Bolivar. However, that's not the most important revolution in this period, from 1750 to 1900. The most significant revolution was not a political revolution, but instead a revolution that transformed the way people produced goods and transported those goods using machines. And this is known as the Industrial Revolution, which begins in 1750, primarily in Great Britain, and then spreads from there to places in Europe, the United States, Russia, Japan. So we'll spend some time talking about how European powers gained control over various parts of Africa and how Africans resisted to those attempts at imperialism. We'll talk about the technological advantages that were possessed by European powers in these efforts to gain control over places in Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia. And we'll talk about how different empires and states responded to industrialization. So we'll talk about those consequences of industrialization and that period 3. And that's 24 to 30% of the AP test. Finally, we'll spend some time in our modern era, which is 1900 to the present. The modern age. You guys know this well. Obviously, this is the era of our modern technology, like our cell phones, which have really transformed the way people get information and share ideas with one another. So we'll talk a lot about global conflict in this period from 1900 to the present. We'll also spend some time talking about the major ideological struggle that emerged following World War II, which was the Cold War, the struggle between the ideas of the West and democracy and capitalism versus the ideas of Marxist socialism and more authoritarian single-party state. We'll also spend some time talking about the way in which empires became uncool after Adolf Hitler. We started to see increasing movement toward decolonization, and how that was fueled in part by a rise in nationalist ideologies as people started to become increasingly proud and wanting to gain independence in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. So we'll also spend some time in this period on how interconnected the world really is, especially after the development of the internet. You can see this through the introduction of McDonald's in different parts of the world, and how, although it's always McDonald's, you always get those golden arches, you'll have just little variations depending upon the cultural traditions of the places where McDonald's is spreading to. And this represents 24 to 30% of the AP test. We use these eras in order to break down world history into time periods in order to make more sense of the human story. We can also break down world history into various geographic regions. What you studied when you were younger, there were 7 continents.
North America, South America, Europe, how arbitrary, right? How does Europe become a continent? Africa, Asia, and Australia. You're going to have to forget all of that for the most part when you take AP World History, because the divisions that we're going to establish are a little bit different. So we could be talking about the Americas, which we would be referencing both North and South America. Or we could break down that further into North America and Latin America. And the division is really the division between modern day United States and Mexico. Any country that speaks a language derived from Latin, like Spanish, is considered part of Latin America. We can divide Latin America even further into Mesoamerica or Middle America here, and the Caribbean, these islands out here. So those are the various divisions that you need to be aware of for the Americas in AP World History. Now, Africa, we can divide Africa up into North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the way it's most commonly seen on the AP test, although they reserve the right to divide up Sub-Saharan Africa even further into West Africa and Central Africa and South Africa and East Africa. Now notice the one place in sort of the continent of Africa that's not included is Egypt. And that's because Egypt is considered part of the Middle East and part of Asia. So Asia we can break down into the Middle East. And again, that's a term that we got to be a little bit careful of. So sometimes they refer to this as Southwest Asia, because it's really only Middle East of Europe, right? So it's east of Europe and it's in the middle of this big landmass. And so this is really a Eurocentric term, the Middle East. So the Middle East, there's South Asia, which is really the Indian subcontinent here with India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. We have Southeast Asia, East Asia, which is mostly China and Japan and Korea, Central Asia, and then Russia, Siberia. So the various ways in which Asia is broken down. And you have to be very careful, because if they ask a question about South Asia and you write about Southeast Asia, you get 0 points on the AP test. Now, Europe can be broken down into Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and that's really going to be important for purposes of the Cold War later on in the class. Oceania, Australia, and also New Guinea here, New Zealand, and the Polynesian Islands out here in the Pacific. We can also break down Europe and Asia. Since this is one connected landmass, oftentimes it'll just be referred to as Eurasia. Or if we include Africa, because Africa was connected to Eurasia for most of world history, we'd call that Afro-Eurasia.
A third way that we can break down world history so that we can better understand it is by dividing it up into various themes. So we divide AP World History into 6 themes, and there's a mnemonic device that we can use to better remember these themes, and it is inspect. Inspect. So the IN stands for interaction with the environment. So the interaction between humans and the environment, that is the in inspect. The S stands for social, which is the development and transformation of different social structures. The P stands for political. So state building, expansion, and conflict. The E stands for economic, the creation, expansion, and interaction of different economic systems. The C stands for cultural, so the development and interaction of different cultures. And the T stands for technological, so the impact of science and technology and innovation. Throughout this course, as we break down and study different time periods and different regions, we will be using these SPICE themes to better organize the way in which we are inspecting world history. So let's talk about the in and inspect, interaction with the environment. So what we're talking about really there is the influence of geography. The more you study world history, the more you start to understand the important role that geography played in the way in which different societies developed and emerged and progressed. There's a great book about this topic, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, where the author Jared Diamond explores the nature of inequality in world history and ties it back to a lot of geographic characteristics like the distribution across the world of different domesticable plants and animals. Really fascinating. He also looks at the way in which the continents were oriented and the impact that ultimately that played in the way in which different states developed across world history. We're also going to be talking about the impact of demography in disease. So demography is the study of people and in particular population. And we can see here, this is a quick video showing the areas where population grew over time during the period that we're going to study from 1200 to the present. And you can see, especially the concentration of population in places like South Asia, East Asia. And we see with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, really the world population just taking off and growing exponentially. This is a graph showing our total population. We're now up to somewhere in the ballpark of 8 billion people. But there's a check on population growth, and that's oftentimes as a result of the introduction of diseases like the bubonic plague or more recently COVID-19. So as human population has grown, the environmental effects on land, water, and biology have been immense. We'll talk about sustaining that large population growth, how you're going to need to engage in deforestation and soil depletion and erosion, and how water is going to become a critical resource for humans and how that leads to diversion of water flows. We're also going to talk a little bit about biological effects. This graph shows the number of extinctions that have taken place and grown, different animals as human populations have grown. We'll talk about pollution, how human beings contributed to it, especially since the Industrial Revolution, the increasing use of fossil fuels and how that has contributed to a change in global temperature. So we're talking about social characteristics. We're really talking about the way in which human beings categorize ourselves into different groups. And one way we do this is by socioeconomic class. So we'll spend a lot of time looking at different societies' socioeconomic class, and it usually is shaped like a pyramid because you have the people at the top, which oftentimes are the fewest, but they have the most wealth and power. And then we have oftentimes these sort of middle classes and then a lower laboring poor class, and that's usually consists of the largest number of people. We'll talk about different gender roles and different gender relations. And the major force in world history known as the patriarchy has led men to claim positions of power and privilege over women, and how women have been fighting back against the effects of the patriarchy. We'll talk about family and kinship groups and this way in which human beings have organized themselves around family. We'll talk about race and ethnic constructions. Race is a very challenging topic in this course because race is not actually a thing. It's not a biological construct. We are 99.9% biologically the same. Now, while race is not really a thing, racism is very much a real phenomenon in world history. The very few biological differences that are perceived among us have been used by people and exploited by people to maintain positions of power and privilege, and that is racism. P is political. We'll talk about different forms of government. The most common form of government in world history being a monarchy, where there's one single centralized ruler, but we've seen, especially more recently, the introduction of more different forms of government, including increasingly democracy. We'll talk about the way in which empires have formed and been constructed over time in world history. Now, this is not really a thing that we're as familiar with because post-World War II, empires became pretty uncool. We'll talk about nations and nationalism, which is something you are more familiar with, the construction of nation states based upon this idea of nationality and a sense of common pride and unity. Now, you see images like this and you say, well, that's an image from Nazi Germany. No, that's actually an image from the United States. These are children who are saying the Pledge of Allegiance. They used to extend their arms, and it was originally a Roman salute until Hitler, of course, made that uncool in World War II. You want a revolution? Well, you know. We'll talk about revolts and revolutions. Now, there is an important distinction that we can draw here. A revolution is a successful overthrow and replacement of the government by the people of that state using some type of force. Revolts are usually unsuccessful attempts to overthrow a government. We'll talk about different global organizations that especially formed in the 20th century, like the United Nations, which are trying to increasingly address issues on a more global level. When we're talking about economic characteristics, we're really talking about the way in which human beings produce goods and services, utilize those goods and services and distribute them. And so we oftentimes associate economics with money, but it's really a lot broader than that. So we will spend some time talking about trade and commerce, how human beings engaged in various forms of exchange of goods, and how important that ultimately was to the spreading of a lot of different things. We'll talk about how goods are produced using different forms of labor. Oftentimes, labor is coerced or forced. So, the most common type of coerced or forced labor that you're familiar with is slavery. But there are other forms of coerced or forced labor that have been used throughout world history. And that is simply a product of trying to exploit the labor of others. We'll talk about agricultural and pastoral production. So, throughout a lot of world history, the vast majority of people spent most of their time trying to produce food for themselves or to live a pastoral lifestyle. A pastoral lifestyle is you're relying upon different domesticated animals. We'll talk about industrialization, which started in around 1750, and the way in which goods are being produced increasingly by machines. We'll talk about these different economic theories, capitalism and socialism. Capitalism developed first by a guy named Adam Smith, and the ideas behind capitalism. Government's role is limited. You allow the free market to determine how many goods to produce, what quality of goods should be produced, what price goods should be sold at. And we contrast that with socialism, where the government plays an increasing role in trying to determine how to allocate goods in a form that is more equal. When we're talking about cultural characteristics, we're really talking about the way in which human beings express themselves. And they express themselves in a number of different ways. They express themselves through their religions, through their faith. And when we're talking about religion, we're really talking about the way in which human beings answer three fundamental questions. How did we get here? What is the meaning or purpose of life? And what happens to us after we die? We'll talk about philosophies, which touch upon some of those same questions, but oftentimes don't do so through as much of a supernatural lens, but instead through more of what we're going to call a secular, non-religious lens. We'll talk about the way people have expressed themselves through art and how art varies. So hopefully after this class, you'll be able to look at different art pieces and be able to identify where those pieces come from and what purpose might lie behind them. We'll talk about architecture, the building especially of monumental architecture, large-scale architecture, oftentimes to legitimize the power of a ruler to show off the wealth and prestige of a particular society. We'll talk about literature, the way in which humans have expressed themselves through different forms of writing. For T, we'll talk about technological characteristics, different innovations that have occurred across the world, from the people of Mesoamerica developing these floating island gardens, incredible, how the people of the Islamic world made improvements in astronomy. We'll talk about the people of Africa and how they developed improvements in metals and metallurgy. So we'll spend some time talking about different inventions and scientific discoveries. In technological, we'll talk about different forms of transportation, especially when we get to the Industrial Revolution with the development of the steam engine and railroads and steamships. We'll talk about how technology was used in warfare. So different technological inventions dating back to some of the developments by the Mongols. And then when we get into our modern era, the use of weapons of war that can produce huge mass casualties. We'll talk about the development of medicine in response especially to the outbreak of various diseases throughout world history. I'm filming this right now in 2020, and so we're certainly hoping that by the time some of you guys are listening to this, there will be a vaccine developed for COVID-19. We can break world history down into these various themes, and we use that mnemonic device, inspect. We can break world history down into different time periods. We can break world history down into different geographic regions. But back to our original big question, how is this course like a Rubik's Cube? When someone hands me a Rubik's Cube, I know I need to organize all the blue on one side and all the red on the other side and all the yellow on the third side. But I don't have the skills to be able to manipulate the Rubik's Cube in a way that makes meaning out of that content or that information. And so that's really what we're going to attempt to do in this course. WHAP develops 4 historical thinking skills, and these are necessary in order to be successful in the various components of the AP World History test. So you have 3 short answer questions known as SAQs. There's 1 long essay question, or LEQ, and there's 1 document-based question, or DBQ. And all of these different types of questions on the AP test are testing your historical thinking skills. So the first historical thinking skill that you're going to have to master is analyzing historical sources. Sometimes we'll just refer to this as sourcing. Let's take a historical source. This is a tweet by Donald Trump. This is from August of 2016. And he writes, President Obama will go down as perhaps the worst president in the history of the United States. When we are sourcing a document, we use a mnemonic device and we call it apart. We're taking the document apart. And the first thing we ask ourselves is, who is the author? Who is Donald Trump? What are the characteristics that Donald Trump possesses that might explain why he's saying what he's saying? So for instance, maybe it might be a reflection of his age or his gender or his religion, or in this case, maybe his ideology. So the fact that he is a Republican and he's writing about a Democratic president might explain why there's a little bit more hostility, and therefore also maybe why he might be exaggerating by stating that he perhaps will go down as the worst president in history. Second thing we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose? Why does Donald Trump tweet? What is the purpose behind using that medium in particular to send out messages? And the purpose behind this may be to engage in exaggerated or hyperbolic conversation to draw attention and attract followers, to gain media attention based on the things that he's saying. Third, who is the intended audience of a source like this? So who are the people that are liking this particular source? Who are Donald Trump's Twitter followers? And might that explain why he might be saying what he's saying? Maybe the intended audience here is he's trying to gain more credibility among Republicans by criticizing the Democratic president, President Obama, or maybe he's trying to simply antagonize Democrats who might be following him. Next, what is the time period, or what is the context for a historical source? What if I told you that this particular tweet was written a few hours after President Obama stated that President Trump was unfit for the presidency? That might impact, maybe even now, the purpose behind this, because now it seems to be maybe President Trump is simply just hitting back in response to an attack against him. All of these aspects or characteristics, who the author is, the purpose, the intended audience, the time period, may have a bearing on the reliability of the document. Does the document have any historic truth value? In this case, I would think objectively we could argue there's probably not a lot of historic truth, again, given what we know about who the author is, what the purpose is, the intended audience, the time period, that maybe the statement may be intended to be more exaggerated or hyperbolic. The reason you need this skill is because on the DBQ, you're going to be confronted with historical sources, and you're going to have to go through that thought process of identifying why might the person be saying what they're saying, given what I know about this particular source. The second historical thinking skill that you're going to have to develop is the skill of comparison. So when you're comparing, you're analyzing similarities and differences, oftentimes between 2 different regions in a certain period of time. You could ask yourself the question, what are the similarities and differences between students at City High School and West High School? Can you create claims around things that are similar? Can you create claims around things that may be differences between students at City and West? Now, the way this will come at you on the AP test is you might get an LEQ prompt like this one. In the late 19th century, states implemented a variety of economic strategies in response to industrialization. Develop an argument that evaluates the difference between the role of the state in Japan's economic development and the role of the state in the economic development of China. Now, I gave this prompt to my daughter. She was 2 at the time, and this is what she said.
Oh shoot. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. Oh shoot.
What happens on the AP test oftentimes is a student will get a prompt like this and they'll look at it and they'll just start going, oh shoot, oh shoot, oh shoot. That is not how you are going to attack the AP test. You're going to have a game plan. You are going to analyze and break down that prompt. You're going to see this critical word right here, develop an argument about the difference, and you're going to say, all right, I got this. This is my skill that I've been practicing of comparison, and I'm going to analyze the differences between Japan's economic development and the economic development in China and the various role the state played in both. You can do this. It's challenging, it's tough, but you're not going to do what my daughter Finley did, which was just sit there saying, oh shoot, for the entire time when you need to be writing your essay. The third historical thinking skill that you're going to need to develop is causation. So causation, you're analyzing causes and effects. You might ask yourself, why did you choose to take this particular class, AP World History? What caused you to do that? You may have heard that it was a good class from a friend. You may have been wanting to challenge yourself with a little bit more rigorous reading and writing assignments. And then think about what are the ultimate maybe effects. Maybe you choose to take the AP test. Maybe potentially you could get college credit. But hopefully you will walk away with a deeper understanding of world history so that you can better use that information and knowledge to understand your world. So this will appear on the AP test with a question like this. Between 1750 and 1900, a variety of ideologies contributed to the development of imperialism. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which new ideologies motivated European imperialism in Africa during the period 1750 to 1900. I'm glad you did not respond by saying, oh shoot, but instead started looking and breaking down that prompt and looking for keywords like this one right here, motivated. That should turn the light bulb on and suggest to you that this might be a causation essay, and so that's the skill that you should be using. The fourth historical thinking skill is known as continuity and change over time. Sometimes we'll just shorten it to CCOT. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do a little exercise, and I want you to watch two videos. They're both of gymnastics from the Olympics. One is from the 1950s and one is from our modern era. And I want you to analyze and identify what are some of the things that have ultimately changed about gymnastics over the course of 50 years, and what are some of the things that have continued and stayed the same. So I hope some of the things you noticed in terms of changes. Let's start there. I mean, the athletes were faster, they were stronger, they were doing more dynamic moves. You could identify a change claim around the way in which gymnastics has evolved in terms of the complexity and the difficulty level. But you also should maybe identify there are some things that have persisted about gymnastics. For instance, they're doing the same various routines. They are wearing similar clothes. And so those are the things that I hope you can identify and create claims around. So when you're doing CCOT, you're analyzing the changes and the things that remain the same over time, or a word we're going to use a lot is persisted, the things that persisted over time. So here you might get a question like, in the period 1450 to 1750, economies around the world relied on slave labor for the production of goods. Develop an argument that evaluates how the institution of slavery changed in the period 1450 CE to 1750 CE. Here, I'm glad your eyeball is hopefully already starting to come towards this word right here, this word change, which suggests that you're using this historical thinking skill of analyzing continuities and changes over time. As a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer this big question. How is this course WHAP like a Rubik's Cube? You should start to understand that world history can be broken down chronologically, treated like a story with different chapters. And so you have to start to understand those important time periods. You have to be able to understand that we can break down the world into different geographic regions. You have to be able to understand that we can break down our study of world history into different themes. And we're going to use all of this knowledge ultimately to improve our various historical thinking skills like sourcing, like comparison, like causation, and like continuities and changes over time. All right, as always, thanks for watching.